Philanthropy in America began as an affair of the very, very wealthy, at least when we focus our conversation on the aspect of giving and fundraising. Helping others goes much deeper uh, and much further back in the human psyche. But when it comes to giving money in an organized way for the purpose of investing in a particular outcome, that started with rich folks. Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller are great examples. There were lots of others. In 1926, the Yale University Capital Campaign raised more than $20 million and had more than half of that money came from just 60 donors. Large-scale gifts were shaping society and the image of the vision of those wealthy donors. But it took the establishment of widespread fundraising for philanthropy to gain the power and influence that it has today. And make no mistake, philanthropy has power. You may not realize, though, that that transition was not inevitable, and not everyone was excited to see philanthropists and the organizations that they created gain support and influence. When John Rockefeller donated $100 million to create his foundation, he was not celebrated as a hero. In fact, members of Congress called for hearings, and members of both parties wondered whether foundations should be allowed to exist in America at all. It took a change in the laws governing giving, and before that, a change in the perceptions of philanthropists and the power of charity by our governmental leaders for the impact that we have now to become possible. And given the heartfelt feelings of some of the members of Congress at the time, and over a number of decades, that impact was not a given. Like I said, Rockefeller didn't receive a charitable deduction in 1913 when he created his foundation with $100 million. But by 1936, when Henry Ford established the Ford Foundation, the laws around giving had changed so much that he was able to use that gift not only to create the foundation, but to pass control of his company to his heirs without paying a single penny in estate taxes. Something was changing, and it was changing with the intent to empower philanthropists. But that impact spread at the top and also for average Americans. Fundraising among people of average financial means had happened before. You can find examples where people really wanted to make a difference. A great example is actually during the American Civil War. There was a group called the United States Sanitary Commission, and they were set up to help the wounded from both sides to recover. And they've received most of their support by establishing offices in cities all across the country. And this was such a widespread phenomenon that even Mark Twain wrote about it. Though I don't think he was a very big fan, as he said, "If the town would only wait an hour, an office would be ready, books opened, and the commission prepared to receive contributions from the multitudes." Across the ocean, you can see examples of similar efforts of goodwill. During the famine in Ireland in the 1870s, the Irish people held benefit concerts around the country, and those were mirrored here in the United States, so that people could help buy food for those impacted. Mass philanthropy, though, strategic giving, really took off in the fight against tuberculosis. That's where it originated. An organization was established with the mission of conquering tuberculosis. This was made possible by the society's growing acceptance of the scientific germ theory, which explains how diseases were spread from one person to another. And that context of having more knowledge and that strategy of organizing people around that knowledge to have an impact really made a difference. And one should not underestimate the impact that tuberculosis was having on society. In 1908, the Census Bureau estimated that 11% of all deaths in America were related to TB. And now people were being told that they had a chance to do something about it by working together. And they did. With the success of the TV funding campaigns and the measurable improvements that the resulting work produced, the idea of giving for a purpose to support a particular cause really took off. The Red Cross created what they called a SEALS campaign, where they sold stamps at post offices around the country. Their first effort raised only $135,000. But in just a few short years, that effort raised over $1 million. By the 1960s, they would be able to raise $26 million in a single mailing with the same approach of selling those stamps. It's not just about the dollars raised, though. In 1905, there were roughly 5,000 people around the nation working on the cause of tuberculosis. By 1915, all that money raised by the National Association for the Study and Prevention of Tuberculosis had recruited 500,000 people to the cause. And that's what pushed the difference. World War I brought a huge leap forward, both in the number of dollars that were raised by organizations, but also in the profile among society and the professionalism among the staff of the organizations. Prior to the war, the Red Cross was still raising most of its money that it didn't get from the government in bake sales and similar things. But when 2.8 million people, American draftees, were sent abroad to fight, that all changed. By June of 1917, the Red Cross had concocted a plan to raise $100 million, mostly through small donations from many, many people. And they did. And 1 year later, they raised $181 million. The Red Cross had now become America's largest charity, larger than the Rockefeller Foundation, larger than the Ford Foundation, and it was being funded by average Americans. Size gave the nonprofits more than the ability to reach larger numbers of beneficiaries, though they certainly did. It also gave them the power to choose who those beneficiaries would be, what their methods of engaging them would be, and what impact they were striving for. And the growth has continued. In 2005, nearly 1 in 10 Americans worked for a nonprofit organization. By 2009, the sector held $3.4 trillion in assets, and that number has only continued to rise over the last decade. Today, when taken as a total sector, philanthropy controls a budget equivalent to that of the Pentagon. Philanthropy is a force to be reckoned with, and it is a force that is entirely in private hands. During World War I, the Red Cross functioned largely as a branch of the government. It supported the official objectives of the war. But that began to change, and by the 1970s and the 1980s, nonprofits had grown large enough and strategic enough to declare their own values, their own visions of the future, and they had constituencies ready to support them in that effort. Really, a confrontation between the government and nonprofits was inevitable. And it came in the form of a famine in Ethiopia. The Cold War had changed foreign policy, and Ethiopia had become a sort of no-go area for American development efforts and American aid efforts. And prior to that time, our nonprofit organizations largely played well with the government and followed those instructions. And so when the Carter administration declared that Ethiopia was not to receive funding, not only from Americans, but objected to the World Bank's involvement, or even the African Bank's involvement, what resulted was that Ethiopia had no Western development or aid funding, no guidance, no structure, and no participation with the Western world. They also had a regime that was withholding resources from its own people, and starvation became real. Somewhere between 10 and 12 out of the 42 million 10 to 12 million out of the 42 million people in Ethiopia were literally on the verge of starving to death by 1983, 1984. In 1984, the BBC aired a news broadcast with footage of those people, and the emotional impact on the world cannot be underestimated. People simply didn't know, but they took responsibility for it when they saw it. Benefit concerts sprouted up in the U.S. as before, but organized around funding campaigns and with global stars like Michael Jackson, and huge amounts of money were raised. In fact, organizations were able to raise nearly $80 million in the first 6 months of their effort alone. They were distributing 20,000 tons of food a month into Ethiopia, and all without the government's permission. Support by American donors, small and big, was so overwhelming that another unprecedented accomplishment occurred. Not only did the nonprofits begin to act without government direction, but the government followed the nonprofits' lead. And now President Ronald Reagan gave, let's see, how much did he give? He gave $45 million out of the U.S. government budget to purchase 80,000 metric tons of food, which he then gave to the nonprofits who had entered Ethiopia and were already working there to distribute. The nonprofits receiving that support were told that they could not use any of their funding whatsoever to support development efforts, only aid. They could feed those who were the most hungry, but they couldn't help the people of Ethiopia beyond that. However, the nonprofits ignored that directive entirely and devoted millions of dollars, $30 million, directly to projects to create sanitation, water, and road projects in Ethiopia, so that the people there would have a fighting chance of sustaining the good that the work and the initial donations had made. Nonprofits, philanthropies, were now in the driver's seat, and they were making changes both to our society and around the world in ways that the government could no longer control. And they had been able to choose their direction and not simply follow the will of a particular donor as well, because they were raising those funds on a mass scale from across the financial segments of society. Philanthropy has impacted our world in remarkable ways in a few short decades. Hunger and poverty issues, but also social change. Changes around marriage laws in the U.S., the civil rights movement, education reform. Much of that has come through the active participation of private citizens in philanthropy. Those of us who are preparing to or already actively leading nonprofit agencies need to understand how much power we really can hold, so that we devise methods for not only building that power, but using it very, very well.